Here's a fair disclaimer up front. In this video, I use she/her to refer to Ralsei and they/them to refer to Chris. This is largely because I believe Ralsei's transition will hold narrative significance in the coming chapters, and I want to entertain the thesis of this video as well as I can, at least for the duration of its runtime. Alternatively, though I argue that Chris's non-binary identity is specifically trans-feminine in nature rather than masculine, I do believe that their identity itself is specifically non-binary. I don't anticipate this changing in the same way I do Ralsei's. Furthermore, what this video is not is a theory. I'm not attempting to make some wild guess about where Chris and Ralsei's characters are going. This video is better described as literary analysis. In this video, I look at what evidence already exists within Deltarune's narrative to describe a reading of the story as it exists now, and how that informs our understanding of what Deltarune is about. All of what I say in this video can be replicated simply by reading the same dialogue that I do, and considering the many possibilities that their meanings may hold. On both fronts, please don't engage with this video simply on the basis of whether you agree morally with my choice regarding Ralsei's pronouns, nor whether you believe any of this will happen. Slow down and listen for a moment. All of this already has happened. We're now just waiting on Toby Fox to conclude it. Alright. Look, angry viewer, I know you saw the thumbnail. I know I made the thumbnail. Yes, I believe that there is ample evidence in Deltarune, especially following the release of Chapter 5, to suggest that both Chris and Ralsei will come to identify along the trans-feminine spectrum, if they do not already. Perhaps you have already heard of the idea of a transfem Ralsei. Perhaps you are part of a very, very loud, vocal minority that believes she is simply a feminine boy, and that forcing him to be a girl is, in itself, actually quite homophobic. I can see your comments already. No, bad, come back here. Watch the video first. Don't type that angry comment. I can see you writing it. Please, before you tell me how wrong I am, and I welcome you to do so after, walk with me. Let your eyes be open to the complexity of this topic and the plethora of supporting evidence towards the transfeminine reading. Not just of Chris and Ralsei's characters, but of Deltarune itself. This game is not just queer. It is specifically speaking to much of the transfeminine experience. That said, how do we as an audience know to identify transfemininity, or queerness at all, within a text? Queer theory, and more specifically transfeminism as a theoretical lens for literary analysis, is more than just simply identifying a character, relating to them, and imposing one's own self onto the fictional. In fact, we'll later get to how the crux of Chris's arc is about resisting this imposition. Coding, reflections of real-world oppression and dysphoria, and explicit references to a character's own queer identity are the primary ways through which queerness is identifiable in a work's narrative. To that end, much of this analysis builds on the coding established specifically in Undertale to retain logical consistency across Toby Fox's own theses. However, a second major element I will invoke is how the text depicts transmisogyny, or the intersection of transphobia and misogyny that uniquely affects trans women and people of transfeminine non-binary identities. Among some recent transfeminists, the terms transmisogyny affected and exempt have been adopted to describe the way this force specifically affects those who undergo this transfeminine transition, regardless of the degree of social or medical change. These terms seem quite useful for my purposes today, as neither of the characters in question here are very explicitly transfeminine, or at least not yet. Much of their coding comes in subtext, missable dialogue, and optional boss fights, not to mention how both, as of the end of Chapter 5, use gender-neutral pronouns. What is at stake with the transfeminine reading of Chris and Ralsei is not necessarily that they will each turn to the camera in Chapter 7 and say, maybe the real W.D. Gaster was the transgender identity I discovered along the way, but that the antagonistic forces, and more aptly oppression, they face within the narrative is reflective of this real-world transmisogyny. Chris may use they/them pronouns, but the way they are treated by the text itself and by us as a fandom flavors their gender expression as existing within a particularly oppressed position, beyond that of simple transphobia. Much the same can be said about Ralsei. Ultimately more important than headcanon and personal identification with our blorbos is the actual conditions under which these characters find themselves suffering, as well as how it reflects the conditions of real-world transfems. With that established, I had already begun formulating a thesis for this video prior to the release of Chapter 5. Transfem Ralsei had always had much more of a standing, at least among certain circles of the fandom, but the transfem reading of Chris was fewer and much farther between. As such, Ralsei's story could, after Chapter 4, be seen as relatively self-explanatory, albeit still largely allegorical in nature. Ralsei seems especially doomed with the weight of the prophecy. Her knowledge on the matter exceeds any other character's, seemingly drilled into her very being through some as-yet ambiguous backstory that relegates her to the role of the prince, with no hope of escaping that fate. This alone is enough to suggest a transfeminine tinge to Ralsei's colors, but her coding extends beyond a singular distaste for the prophecy's unalterable script. As Tumblr user itti-the-mouse has previously compiled, subtle coding for a transfeminine Ralsei exists throughout the length of Deltarune's ludonarrative experience. Transfemininity for Ralsei is a resistance against the prophecy experienced both through text and the actual playing of the game, as equipping her with the white ribbon prompts special dialogue. The ribbon also later comes to be paired with pink and blue ribbons to complete the colors of the trans flag. The game itself further resists Ralsei's coming out, refusing to remove her hat from relevant UI elements despite her own choice to step further into personhood. What, to me, is the most interesting of Itti's pre-Chapter 5 conclusions, however, is those that relate to Ralsei's room. Of course, the scene that takes place here plays the track Lost Girl, which remains the only of its kind to play the song for a character that does not actively identify as a woman. This is a notable piece of evidence on its own, yet the more interesting for my own framework is the apparently internalized transmisogyny that Ralsei displays here. Ralsei gives herself nothing. She is a darkner, an object given unnatural life, and as such, she believes, she deserves nothing. She has no material comforts, and her special abilities in the more peaceful sections of the Dark Worlds are routinely objectifying. She activates stool form R, though this is copied from Lancer, and repeatedly becomes a simple block in the TV boards so that we can push her around to complete our own objectives. Each of these speak to an especially transfeminine experience. Given that she must obey the prophecy and the whims of those around her, Ralsei makes herself smaller, even despite the immense courage and radical self-empowerment required to come out, or in her case, remove her hat. The transfeminine transition itself is much the same. We are required to build this confidence, this purest expression of selfhood, yet the dominant forces of society, especially religion for the Ralsei allegory, wield transmisogyny such that we are required to fade into the background of all discussions surrounding queerness. Even among wholly queer spaces, like the Fuck Squad itself, if the space is led by or otherwise overwhelmingly TME, this oppression remains enforced. And, even on their adventures, Ralsei is not spared from casual transmisogyny, both at the hands of her allies and the game itself. This is all well and good, but what on earth does this have to do with Chris being transfeminine? Well, have you ever stopped to consider what exactly Ralsei is? Of course you have. You're a Deltarune fan. You think she's the horned headband, or maybe some green crayons. A knife, perhaps? My honest belief is that Ralsei is Chris's fursona. This is an idea previously posed by Sunny Sun Sins, though she specifically argues against calling Ralsei a fursona. Ralsei, under her theory, is specifically the drawing of this fursona. I would give some pushback on this idea, as to me, the item of the drawing isn't as important. What matters is that Ralsei is connected inherently to Chris's own identity. What specific object this connotation is tied to does not matter so much, given that our understanding of darkners, like that proposed by Cherry Bomb TV's ideas, require that the item itself hold a certain meaning for the lightener whose fountain gives the darkner life. This can particularly be seen in both Chapter 1's game of jacks, which turns the ball useless and the jacks themselves into a coat hanger, and, more recently, Gerson becoming the sound of justice after Susie attempts to recreate the church's dark world. In either case, the fountain's creator is unable to assign meaning to these objects, and they lack any real personality within their worlds. It's a miracle they haven't turned into stone, though perhaps the sound of justice always was. Ralsei, alternatively, follows Chris to every dark world they enter or open, leaving none of the sparkles behind that other objects do upon entering. She is always near, never too far behind the player, and, most importantly, she resembles Chris's brother. Despite the resemblance, Chris actively argues that Ralsei's identity is different from Azriel's, with Susie at the beginning of Chapter 4. One might expect this from any OC that resembles a real person. Our pride in our creation would lead us to defend our Mary Sues even if they are, perhaps, a bit uninspired. But, to me, this defense strikes more as revelatory of the sheer significance Ralsei holds in Chris's mind. Ralsei, it seems, is the idealized version of Chris. We know Chris experienced a type of dysmorphia as a child. They have baggage around being a human instead of a boss monster, chiefly evidenced by the aforementioned horned headband. Their identity as a human is colored by a want to be something else. On one hand, a monster, on another, kind and courteous. Chris, fearing their own personhood, wanted to be made as small and acceptable as possible. So long as they managed to fit into the Dreamer family with their headband, all was well. Through this perspective, we might be able to sort of transpose transfemininity onto Chris's characterization, wholly through the connections between the two characters. But if the Ralsei monster Sona theory holds, there is one key aspect of Ralsei's identity that Chris presumably constructed, which stands out as particularly interesting. Ralsei is presented to us as a boy, and further, a boy that questions her identity. If Chris had always identified as non-binary under an all humans are non-binary theory, or even was transmasculine, boyhood would not need to be a qualifier for the idealized, palatable version of Chris that made them more acceptable as a piece of the Dreamer household. And as such, if the basis of Ralsei's personality is largely based upon Chris's own intentions and their history with gender dysphoria, the argument becomes not that Chris is transfeminine because they resemble Ralsei, but that Ralsei's inevitable transition or resistance against the prophecy is reflective of Chris's own dysphoria and hard-fought identity. On that note, let's talk about Man-Country. Immediately, Man-Country reinforces a non-binary identity for Chris that stands separate from masculinity. While a surface-level reaction might assert that Chris is able to enter Man-Country, perhaps suggesting their transmasculinity, the rest of the area's dialogue suggests the opposite. Lines such as "Welcome to Man-Country" and "It's a man's world" reinforce that this place is quite clearly reserved for men, yet, in a rather fraternity-esque fashion, the final sign is a clear response to Chris's transfemininity. "Non-men are A-OK too" reads as a hasty addition, tacked onto Man-Country to ensure the space remains open to them, even as they veer further away from masculinity through their non-binary identity. Chris can still be a brother in this fraternity, because our bylaws now legally consider man to be a neutral term, inclusive of all people, rather than the gendered term it clearly is. I assert this trajectory, rather than the transmasculine transition, largely because Man-Country is clearly representative of Chris's past. Not only are both of the egg rooms in chapters 3 and 4 representative of some sort of trauma and past experiences with isolation, but the Forgotten Island itself is designed to replicate an art style belonging largely to video games that precede Deltarune's in-universe timeframe. Where Deltarune itself resembles an SNES-era video game, and seems to take place sometime during the 2010s based on the references to Leitner's experiences with a Minecraft equivalent, each of the TV boards, Man-Country, and the Mantle minigames invoke both NES and original Game Boy level hardware. Man-Country itself is especially dated in Chris's past through the Seven Flying Aces dialogue. In some manner, imaginary or otherwise, Chris used to regularly visit Man-Country to play with their copied toys, and, simply, they no longer do. Tricky Tony, as always, does not let the symbolism end with one reading of the word man, as Chris's isolation as represented by Man-Country is tied not only to their transfemininity, but to their body dysmorphia surrounding being the only human in Hometown. While the man in Man-Country is certainly gendered male, man has indeed been used by older high fantasy stories as a blanket term for humanity as a whole. Considering the age attributed with Man-Country, Fox is likely invoking this more antiquated patriarchal meaning for man in tandem with the more explicitly gendered meaning that speaks more directly to Chris's trans identity. This demonstrates that Chris's transness and humanity are tangled up in one another, given that both contribute to the sense of discomfort they feel within their own body. As I previously have pointed out, Chris's body dysmorphia around the horn headband is itself representative of and associated with their queer identity, as both interrupt the more idealized Ralsei-like image that Chris seems to have once wanted, or been expected, to uphold. With this context, we can begin to make something of a speculative, if perhaps fanfiction-y, timeline for Mancountry. First, Chris invents this imaginary space in their mind for playtime, reserved only for themselves, as a respite from being so isolated in hometown. This is the human Mancountry, and it is a man's world. It is designed for their own happiness, giving them a space they can control. As previously stated, I do not believe that Chris simply spawned as a non-binary child. Their transition is relevant to their characterization, lest Chris ultimately be very poor non-binary representation that reinforces the writing stereotype that only inhuman, or in this case unmonstrous, characters are allowed to exist outside of the binary. Following the human interpretation, the next step is the gendered male Mancountry. As Chris begins to realize and actualize their own identity, Mancountry no longer feels like a space in which they belong. It's still a man's world, but Chris is not a man. Manhood is a looming threat, and while they try to tell themselves that non-men are okay too, they stop playing with their 7 aces. Around this time in Chris's life seems to be some angst surrounding Azriel himself, and, stay with me here, Icy. Rather than invoke the Spamton sweepstakes version of Icy as some sort of cryptid, Icy is tangentially related to Chris's transition in that, as Azriel grew up, manhood came naturally to him. At the very least, he takes to the performance quite well, as the difference between Chris and Azriel's boyhood is reflected in their bathroom of all places. Azriel, at some point, grew sick of relying on his mother. He grew up, and the apple shampoo was no longer enough for his rebellious teenage self-expression. He turns instead to his Icy's Cool Boys body spray for the boys, flaming hot pizza flavor, which, having left Chris as the only teenager in the house, now goes completely unused. The apple-scented shampoo, seemingly chosen by Toriel, seems to have been enough for Chris. In either case, between Mancountry and their refusal of this heavily boy-coded body spray, Chris seems to want to have avoided any possible male future awaiting them. Chris routinely abandons references to their masculinity, portraying an obvious level of discomfort around being associated with man or even boyhood. It perhaps follows that objects like the horned headband, representative of Chris's self-sacrificial male monster performance, are mysteriously missing from the player's view. We have now the skeleton of a transgender allegory. Much of this is coding we can glean from the text, but it takes enough of a backseat that many players find themselves asking, what does it matter? This flavor seems perhaps irrelevant to the actual content of the story, focused on the myths and monsters that go bump in the night. Does queerness really matter? Does Chris's identity matter beyond simply differentiating them from being a blank slate self-insert for the player to project themselves upon? To answer this question, I choose to turn to Undertale, which is a move I do not take lightly. I fully expect Deltarune to thoroughly differentiate itself from Undertale as a piece of art. While the characters and themes are superficially similar, we've already seen how fundamentally different even core concepts like determination are between the two titles. As such, expecting Deltarune to fully mirror Undertale in its meaning, morals, and outcomes seems to be a fallacy. In fact, much of what seems to be built around Susie and choosing eternity is in direct contradiction with what Undertale argues can constitute moral play. Where Undertale wants us to leave after Pacifist, Susie and the fact that there is something more important than finding an ending suggests that love, as Undertale presents it, doesn't need to necessitate separation. While that's a topic for another video, my point is that Deltarune is engaging in a direct conversation with Undertale. Even if Fox wrote both, he seems to be exploring and clarifying what Undertale got wrong through Deltarune's narrative. Any opportunity he has in Deltarune to clarify his broader thesis, as an author, is something worth investigating. With that in mind, why do we need to have played Undertale first? It isn't a sequel by any means, yet the Deltarune website's FAQ page mentions the following, quote, "It's just a game you can play after you complete Undertale, if you want to," unquote. This comes right after Fox seems to suggest that the stories operate independently of one another, but there's still a distinct order in which we are expected to play the games. Deltarune so heavily resembling Undertale doesn't mean anything if it isn't attempting to play on our expectations for the genre in the same way that Undertale did, and further subvert our expectations of Fox, having carried them over from Undertale itself. As such, it's very, very interesting to see where Undertale and Deltarune mirror each other on a metatextual level, rather than simply stopping at, oh look, Toriel's my mom again. And, for the purposes of this video, and those of my channel more broadly, the answer to this question speaks both to the one I proposed about Chris, and more broadly to the function that queerness has in Fox's series of works. Have you ever noticed that Undertale is, like, really gay? If you've watched my previous video, you'll see where I'm coming from here. Not only are there the obvious explicit characters, as well as the less clearly coded characters, but I argued there that the closet, as a metaphorical concept, is fundamentally baked into the game's pacifist narrative. While you can watch that video for a more in-depth analysis, the shorter version is simply that the oscillation between safety and friendship versus isolation and horror mirrors the necessary two lives that many queer individuals uphold. Those where we are safely able to be ourselves, and those where we need to be on the back foot, placing self-protection over identity. I argue for the pacifist route as a horror story through this constant, uneasy balance between tension and security, which is a relatively uncommon move among scholars interested in game studies. Undertale, broadly speaking, is interesting to such scholars only insofar as its branching paths cause the game to emphasize the ludic over the narrative. Put less charitably, Undertale is only interesting if its de facto main story is placed in conversation with the genocide route. I explicitly tried to avoid discussing the genocide route in the previous video because its horror elements seemed too obvious, too easy. But for the purposes of this argument, the difference in tone between pacifist and genocide Undertale is incredibly important. Most notably, and as I argued there, because queerness is systemically erased from the genocide narrative. Queerness is central to the pacifist route explicitly to accentuate the horror of genocide and to make us personally complicit in the choices we decide to make, even within fiction. Genocide would not be nearly so meaningful in Undertale if not for the presumption that we played the pacifist route first. We are meant to fall in love with the characters, see their humanity despite their being monsters, and queerness is one of the fundamental elements of characters like Alphys and Undyne. It is what makes them human, despite their being monsters, despite their being fiction. Through unethical play, we destroy any opportunity this connection might have had to emerge, as in routes where we refuse to see the monsters as human enough, we never see their queerness. I tie this back to Deltarune because this is one of the few instances where Undertale's ludonarrative structure is explicitly mirrored in the former. The same erasure of queerness occurs in the weird route, as we functionally replace the canon queerness of Susie and Noelle's relationship with a more insidious version of that between Chris and Noelle. While normally Chris's relationship with Noelle is not inherently abusive nor heteronormative, their childhood sweetheart dynamic is missing from the weird route. Instead of being able to describe a healthier Chriselle as lesbian, the weird route presents a relationship that is explicitly predicated upon the removal of both characters' agency. It enforces the relationship that the Holidays and Dreamers, seemingly and especially Carol, might view as more socially acceptable than the queerness that Susie introduces into their more picturesque, nuclear family lives. While Chapter 5 seems to suggest that Noelle is still interested in Susie on the weird route, to a degree, this interest is more distant and detached. Furthermore, regardless of whether it happens off-screen, the player is explicitly disallowed from seeing this romance. Because of our unethical play, we are disallowed from regarding the characters as people, because we have replaced their will with our own. Metatextually speaking, the weird route here is invoking much of the same gaming history that Dragon Blazers and the Mantle board games do, considering they all seem to be tied to each other through being adaptations of the same prophecy in one way or another. This is all further connected to the way Deltarune mirrors Undertale's ludonarrative, as where Undertale is more concerned with the ludic elements of gaming and how our choices can impact the efficacy of their stories, Deltarune seems to be a much more emphatic response to concepts like heteronormativity, homophobia, and transphobia in gaming. By connecting immoral play to the stereotypes associated with more antiquated titles, Fox is more actively critiquing the JRPG genre's tendency to write boy meets girl stories here than he does in Undertale. The prophecy, representative of the retro game's narrative, regularly enforces generic tropes like there being a blank slate protagonist, a girl being secondary to them, and a mage simply existing nearby. Love finds its way to the girl, and only the girl. And, through the weird route, we ensure that the protagonist is the subject of this love. Where Susie seems to have complicated the prophecy in some way, being the dragon rather than the girl according to Gerson, the weird route seems representative of the player who rejects her version of the story. Susie is the object of the girl's affection, contrary to what we might expect with our metatextual understanding of the RPG genre. Fox, graciously, has offered a version of the story that falls more in line with our expectations, but he makes it clear that placing ourselves over Susie, Chris, and Noelle in this manner is an act of violence, criticizing the genre and the player themselves. It may seem bizarre to describe placing Chris in Susie's place as heteronormative for this reading to work, as, given my own arguments, Chris is not a man. While I agree with that statement, I would gesture back to my attempts to describe the differences between the unhappy, weird route version of their relationship versus the more cheerful one that is suggested to have been in their pasts. In our attempts to remove Chris's agency during the weird route, we supplant Chris's identity with our own. The person Chris fears Noelle speaking to in Chapter 4 is not themselves, but us, piloting their body. Given the critique of gaming history laden within the weird route, I would not think it a stretch to assume that Fox is operating with the above assumption that our cultural tendency is to assign male to the protagonist as default. Perhaps even that the dominant majority of his audience will be male simply because they are gamers. The hobby, even in the wake of cultural resistance like Gamergate and the disappearance of obvious girl games, seems to remain overwhelmingly stereotyped as male. In either case, whether the players themselves are male or the criticism is more directed at the generic conventions of the RPG, Chris is nonetheless stripped of their status as an independent person, and in the process, ungendered. Chris's identity does not matter to the Weird Route player. As to pair them, and by proxy the player, with Noelle, a heteronormative marriage is simulated through the events of Chapter 2. Chris is placed in a position of power over Noelle, instructing her murders, eventually being forced to insist that they are more than friends, before ultimately proposing to her by equipping the Thorn Ring. Of course, this is another act of violence. Given that Noelle does not want to equip it again in Chapter 4, and that the ring itself more literally harms her, both between it being a splinter and the way it reduces her health in combat. And where Noelle seems clearly to be dressed as a princess or a bride in the Dark World, placing Chris in this male position adjacent to her necessitates that we ignore their identity to make them, and ourselves, the groom. While we're here, on the topic of the Thorn Ring in Chapter 2, there is a certain Darkner that perhaps throws a wrench into this analysis. We all know him, we all love him, some of us a little too much. It's Spamton! Clearly, Spamton is meant to be reminiscent of much of what Mettaton brings to the queer reading of Undertale. Having the same arc around the Neo body, the Addisons are selling the Mettaton dress that seems to represent shedding one's old wardrobe, and even on a more metatextual level, Spamton Neo is obviously a revisit of the Mettaton Neo fight we never got, as many of the secret bosses are. Simply by this proximity to Mettaton, one could argue, Spamton himself is coded as transmasculine, and his closeness with Chris, both in story and in solo Chris gameplay, makes it clear that Spamton is a quote-unquote Chris fight, though, in retrospect, all but Jevil and Gerson could be narrowed down in this fashion. Because Spamton seems to be such an obvious allegory for Chris, both being puppeted by forces beyond their comprehension, it would be easy to take these similarities as the be-all end-all confirmation of Chris's transmasculine identity. Spamton's strings, his wanting to aim for heaven, needing to be a bigger and bigger big shot, each of these are about reclaiming a body that was once objectified and used, as all Darkners are. Under the patriarchal culture we largely find ourselves in, this is perhaps an especially compelling storyline for the transmasculine audience, as the same objectification is levied against women and those society perceives to be women. Establishing oneself as important, as human, and perhaps most powerfully as man against this othered position may very well be an inspiring thought. It is one we see reflected in Spamton, and through him, perhaps Chris. Despite that, when the allegory is described in this fashion, there's nothing inherently transmasculine about it. While Chris clearly has their own strings, between us, Carol, and the knight, transfeminine expression is similarly objectified and contrary to patriarchal ideas of gender, simply for both of transfemininity and masculinity being transgender identities in a cis-normative culture. Either case describes a person's willingness to establish their comfort and reality as important over all others' perception. The only difference is the level of respect allotted to each gendered position that a person can find themselves occupying, and patriarchy naturally empowers the masculine before it does the feminine, neutral, and all else. Spamton's allegorical meaning for Chris need not be lost in the case of a transfeminine Chris, as each of their experiences with fate, an allegorical equivalent for transphobia in Deltarune, speak to this larger need for both characters to express themselves and be more than what they are deemed by society or the prophecy. However, despite this brief solidarity between the two of them, Spamton actively objectifies Chris himself when he initiates the secret boss fight. Where the soul is representative of both Chris's and our own agency in Deltarune, Spamton wants to revoke that power, that light, and that personhood such that he can better himself. If we are going to take each character's respective transcoding seriously, there is little other way to describe this exchange than a betrayal, a revelation of Spamton's own transmisogyny, as he asserts that Chris is merely there for his convenience and betterment, more than willing to cast them aside as he rises towards social power, or, in other words, heaven. But wait, did you catch that? What did I mean by fate being an equivalent for transphobia? Actually, I've buried the lead a bit there. In fact, I'd specifically argue that fate, as represented by Deltarune's prophecy, is most effectively equivalent with, and most destructive when applied as, transmisogyny. Let's talk about the girl. Looking at the fandom reaction to the prophecy's text, the most common and obvious interpretations of the girl's identity tend to be Susie and Noelle, potentially both, or potentially either, depending on the chosen route. And while it seems possible that there are two distinct girls in the prophecy, being that associated with hope and love, and the one that comes last, more interesting here is the former. Susie and Noelle being weirdly interchangeable in this position starts to establish what it means for characters not only to be the girl as it is relevant to the prophecy, but it dictates who is allowed to be feminine, as well as what femininity may look like in Deltarune. On a surface level, the prophecy seems to, in fact, allow for quite the range of presentations when it comes to femininity. While Noelle is perhaps a more stereotypical interpretation of what, quote, the girl, unquote, might look like in a standard JRPG, being rather timid, delicate and proper in diction, and more traditionally feminine in dress, each at the beginning of her character arc, of course, Susie's more butch presentation is presented as a relatively admirable form of expression. Of course, her influence is guiding Noelle toward a more defiant and empowered presentation, even as she continues to present in that traditional manner, but Susie is continually presented outside of her interactions with Noelle as the borderline protagonist. Though we presume ourselves to be the protagonist simply as a result of our ludic control of Chris, Susie's choices routinely supersede our own, between both how she directly tells us as much, and through the repeated necessity of Susie's idea to resolve combat. Effectively, Susie's justifiably assertive and assured personality is rewarded within the game's moral framework with independence, screen time, and power over its narrative elements. Either case proves that femininity is highly variable and can be presented in a myriad of ways. Even so, Susie's butch presentation seems to subvert Noelle's as more desirable, especially if, indeed, she has replaced Noelle's role within the prophecy as the second hero. Susie's personality seems to grant her a certain power, which Gerson rightly identifies as being rooted within her hope and determination, beyond that of the more stereotypical identities that surround her, largely because she stands in a gendered position opposed to the typical demands of the JRPG genre. Susie is a thing of resistance, and her femininity is affirmed by the prophecy even despite how she implicitly challenges its notions of what it means to exist within the confines of Deltarune, as the prophecy and device seem to understand it. And yet, the prophecy does not unilaterally affirm this type of gendered resistance. While Susie's butchness is rewarded by the game's narrative, the two transfeminine expressions in question here today are routinely denied by the prophecy and the game's other characters. Ralsei is perhaps the more obvious of the two. As per the most common interpretations of transfem Ralsei, her transition is reflective of her character arc's emphasis on learning to resist the prophecy to establish her own personhood, despite what her own monologue at the beginning of Chapter 3 might assert about the nature of darkners as objects and playthings, existing without any agency or right to identity. Ralsei's character arc is defined by her purpose as the third hero, requiring that she adhere to her role as, quote, Prince of the Dark, unquote, and march towards the game's presumably dark fate. She is not allowed to consider any other option, or, at least, she doesn't seem to believe she is. Ralsei's fear and hesitation compose her initial personality and identity prior to her character arc, as destiny and responsibility form her before she is even allowed to decide what being Ralsei-like is. Here, the prophecy seems implicitly prohibitive of Ralsei's own resistant identity, regardless of whether that ultimately manifests in the narrative as canon transfemininity, which, going by Chapter 5, it will. We'll get there. In fact, it's largely Susie's influence, including some from Chris, that seems to have spurred Ralsei's growth. Susie's implicit and explicit resistance against the prophecy each have encouraged her to believe that it will change, even as the results of Chapter 4 depict the whims of fate as continuing along their set path. Considering the importance of the girls in the prophecy, any attempt to consider Ralsei as a candidate for this position is one that runs contrary to its own intentions and limitations. Implicitly, the prophecy itself disallows Ralsei from femininity by enforcing her role as prince, creating a paradox where certain transgressive femininities are privileged over others, namely those which are transmisogyny exempt. Similarly, following the events of Chapter 5, Chris's gender expression has become more and more explicitly placed in an antagonistic relationship with the prophecy. While discussing Deltarune with some friends on Discord, we had the thought that Chris's romantic prospects are especially emphasized during Chapter 5. The single most notable and memorable instance is Pink's hangout, following her secret boss fight, where Susie and Ralsei each deliberately shoot down Pink's advances on Chris for them, regardless of the choice the player makes. While this contributes to the ongoing "our choices don't matter" narrative arc, it seems more interesting when analyzed from the perspective interested in deconstructing transmisogyny. Chris repeatedly presents us with the option to flirt with enemies among their acts. Their reactions to our choices at the festival suggest simultaneous jealousy and interest in both Susie and Noelle. And they do not resist our choice to double down on Pink's advances the way they do choices they hate, such as forcing them to say they will never play the piano again, or telling Susie to back off of Noelle, both of which admittedly only occur on the weird route or after aborting it. Each of these cases seem to build the picture that Chris does want to find love, yet regardless of the precise instance, the key similarity between each of Chris's attempts to find this love is the result. They are denied, because according to the prophecy, they are not the girl. Love finds its way to the girl does not necessitate exclusivity. It does not say that love only finds its way to the girl. However, Chris's romantic rejection being enforced by the prophecy aligns with the same oppression that Ralsei experiences as a result of Deltarune's dictated fate. Considering further that I have previously argued that Chris's and Ralsei's respective gender expressions are linked through their shared identity as composite components of Chris Dreamer, it is not hard to argue for a parallel between their treatments at the hands, or words, of the prophecy. Furthermore, this interpretation of the prophecy is enforced exclusively by agents outside of their own control. Even if we presume that Chris is consenting to our choices to flirt, and we become a suddenly benign eldritch horror possessing their body, Susie and others simply become another layer of opposing forces making their choices for them. The world itself, whether through our hands or those of its NPCs, seems diametrically opposed to allowing Chris to seek happiness through love, much less their freedom. And while the prophecy seems to be capable of holding double meanings in case of our choice to enact the weird route or not, in neither case is it Chris specifically who is allowed to gain love. It is only ever Susie and or Noelle. And, side note, if there is at least one more hidden best route, it seems likely that it would be the way we finally break the prophecy. Only here would Chris and Ralsei each be able to be the girl and find love. That only Susie and Noelle seem to be applicable candidates for the girlhood speaks subtextually to real-world transmisogyny that surrounds cis-lesbian identities and spaces. While I'm certainly not arguing here that I think Susie and Noelle are being actively transmisogynistic and attempting to disenfranchise Chris within their shared social spheres, I do think that the prophecy itself dictates that such forms of gender expression will be ostracized simply based on the observable effects that it has already had on these varying queer identities. The prophecy, being designed to resemble stereotypical JRPG storylines, contains certain implicit values, many of which are conservative in nature. Not because Fox himself is attempting to write a conservative story, but because he intends to have us subvert it through moral play. A moral play which will reveal more queerness and humanity in the story's characters as it progresses, as did Undertale. Susie's presence in the narrative has already shaken the prophecy's hold on identity to a certain degree. The girl is not falling for a male hero, she is falling for another girl. However, Susie's butch expression trends toward the traditionally masculine to suit the usual dynamic of a hero paired with a damsel in distress. The prophecy seems to self-correct even when it is minorly disrupted, which, as we see in Chapter 4, is the greater meaning behind the glass panels always reappearing later, even when shattered. Just as I believe the best ending of Deltarune, if there is one, will see us pushing the prophecy further toward queerness and freedom, eventually demolishing the prophecy's limiting roles and expressions altogether, we have already seen that the prophecy can similarly be adjusted to follow more closely to its JRPG roots. The weird route itself is such an attempt. As others have already pointed out, even the very way the game is broken in Chapter 5's Weird Route, requiring the bread and a single other female party member, resembles older JRPGs, specifically Mother. And even if the pieces of the prophecy itself are being skipped through the Weird Route, the themes and narrative themselves have only become more restrictive. As much as Noelle thinks we are approaching freedom, Ralsei is most likely right. Whatever we're doing on this route is worse. Okay, most of what we've discussed so far has been the conclusions we can draw about transfemininity in Deltarune prior to Chapter 5, though I've begun to slip references in where they are relevant. Much of this has been the reanimated corpse of a video I had intended to write prior to Chapter 5, but I never found the time to make it work. I feared that, whatever Chapter 5 did, it would make this reading somehow incompatible with the story's intentions, but it quite clearly has only bolstered transfemininity's relevance in Deltarune. It's come to a point where I believe the narrative as a whole, at the very least for Ralsei, seems intrinsically tied to gender, transfemininity, and the radical self-determination and fear alike with which they are associated. As such, most of what remains here is the ramifications that Chapter 5 has had on this reading, and oh god are they massive! Obviously, spoilers have been in effect for this entire video, but if you somehow are still behind and need to avoid any further revelations, this would be a good time to stop watching. Otherwise, we can talk a little more about Ralsei now, and surprisingly, a trans-feminine reading of Ralsei no longer seems to be merely implied, but pretty clearly suggested. Again, while I doubt Ralsei will ever turn directly to the camera and say, "Guys, I think I'm transgender," the narrative is only further moving her arc in the direction of tying her personal identity to her willingness to subvert the prophecy. While that arc has not fully been completed, her willingness to use fire magic and Flowery's suggestion that she is a princess are certainly ample ammunition. However, the latter remains contained to optional scenes. It's likely that further development is waiting for us in the final few chapters. Ralsei's transition is an arc in motion, and the more characters do explicitly mention her identity, the more obviously Deltarune will count among very few notable works of popular culture wherein a trans woman's identity is given the opportunity to explore the many complications of living in the closet. Indeed, it already is if we are willing to listen. Personally speaking, I find that idea very exciting, considering how many more works of pop culture fundamentally rely on transmisogyny to fuel their humor and horror affects alike. Of course, specific pieces of evidence for the transfeminine Ralsei reading are quite plentiful in Chapter 5, ranging from the very beginning to the very end of the chapter's runtime. In order, moments that directly demonstrate how Ralsei's character arc relates to her gender include her position as literal princess in Castletown's climbing minigame, Flowery forcibly closeting and subsequently detransitioning Ralsei by putting her hat back on, Flowery subtly changing tune, acknowledging that Ralsei is a princess and offering her yet more items colored like the trans flag, and finally, being referred to with they-them pronouns by both her Dark Vine status and Asgore before closing the fountain. This chapter, though it doesn't explicitly pay off the trans feminine reading of Ralsei outside of the Dark Vine title's motion away from masculinity, is otherwise a turning point for the canonicity of her queerness. Ralsei's transfemininity is practically undeniable now, given how central it is to her experiences in Chapter 5, outside of what I would consider particularly faithless readings of this obvious signposting. While each of these instances is clear evidence, especially taken together, the one I want to dwell on briefly is the scene in Castletown, as Ralsei's dialogue here may be potentially confusing and seem perhaps limiting for any of those viewers and listeners who are not themselves transfeminine or have not experienced a similar hesitation around transition. The line, quote, "as long as it's what other people want, of course," unquote, seems to have caused quite the division among readings of Ralsei's character, as many seem to believe that it indicates that Ralsei, in fact, does not want to be a princess, and the role is being forced upon her by the player's insidiously transfeminine intentions. This, as I just described, is a flagrant bad faith reading of the scene, both in terms of the lines that immediately precede it, as well as the later arc Ralsei is spurned into addressing by Flowery. Firstly, the most damning evidence is that Ralsei is immediately excited to be allowed to present as a princess, literally claiming, "I'm so excited," and "it's fun to try new things," before immediately walking her elation back and shifting responsibility onto others, most obviously Chris and the player both, as is her typical habit. Speaking as a trans woman here, it could not be more clear to me that what Ralsei wants here is permission, because transition is hard. One of the single most common fantasies among trans feminine people I know, including myself, is to have it solved for you. To have acceptance and opportunity neatly laid out for us, so that being ourselves feels even slightly more accessible than an otherwise uncaring world would like to permit. Ralsei here knows already. She knows later on with Flowery too. What is stopping her is not that her egg has not cracked, but transmisogynistic forces such as the prophecy, and more generally, the expectations it seems to guarantee that others will hold for her. She reveals a deeper desire here, hence her excitement, realizes she does not have that guaranteed safety, and scrambles to find some way to pass off suspicion. She has effectively been asked, "Why are you playing as a girl in this MMO?" and reached for the classic response, "I'd rather stare at a girl than a boy for 100 hours. Her later interactions with Flowery reiterate this point. Flowery can tell too, and despite how he prioritizes Asgore's comfort over Ralsei's identity, he does inevitably try to offer Ralsei the acceptance she desires. Rage baiting be damned, Flowery sees through the boy mode and assures Ralsei that she can do what she wants, be who she wants, have wants at all, regardless of the prophecy's rules. Her dream can be real, no matter how fleeting. Of interest here is that while I believe this arc will become required in future chapters, this scene is optional, which implies that it is meant to happen in private. This is something for which I have to commend Flowery, as much as I disliked him at the beginning of the chapter. Outside of this scene, the two are still able to uphold the roles that the prophecy, their friends, and their families expect of them. However, in confidence between each other, Flowery is surprisingly safe for Ralsei's transition. While this confuses and angers her, both in the moment and during the chapter's climax, I believe that Flowery can so easily see through Ralsei and understand her because they share a metatextual origin. Put humorously, you could say that they are both a step Asriel once removed. Each of them are people whose identities are founded first on who they are not. Ralsei may look and act the way we expect Undertale Asriel to, but she is not Asriel. Flowery clearly is a similar play on Flowey, despite his very separate character, corrupting both Flowey's name and that of his theme song. It's interesting, then, that each of them are derivative of the same person. Asriel has an invisible influence over each of their characters in a way that suggests they live in the shadows of others, even as Chapter 5's narrative largely focuses on the two of them. Flowery so readily identifies with Ralsei because they share this struggle. Here, perhaps, is another opportunity to read transmasculinity in Deltarune via Flowery himself, and it certainly resolves itself better for Ralsei than Chris's encounter did with Spamton. Again, this leaves us in a position where the transfeminine reading of Ralsei's character is fairly straightforward. Ralsei is actively displaying a desire and being encouraged to be a princess by those who are willing to see her for more than the controlled manner in which she tries to present herself. More complicated, as always, is Chris's transfemininity, as the new characters who are introduced in Chapter 5 speak quite clearly to their identity and the complex relationship they have with it. Something worth noting is that while writing this script, a video quite similar to this one was released by infizero.mp4 discussing the role of gender more generally in Chapter 5. While much of that video understandably focuses on Ralsei's new character development, they make a reference to Seth's identity that echoes a sentiment I previously shared about Chris's own non-binary identity. It matters that these characters transitioned. That Seth's dead name and chosen name are each discussed on screen, and Seth's hangout with Aqua explicitly confirms that Seth is non-binary as a real identity, not simply as a lack of identity, reflect the importance of Chris's own identity beyond what characters like Kara and Frisk allowed for in Undertale. As I previously implied, and as I directly responded to Infizero's video, it matters that Seth's transition is real for the same reasons that Undertale's queerness humanized its monsters. We are supposed to question how real the characters are, concluding that they are real enough to matter. Hence Chapter 5's main conflict being whether it is right to seal the Flower King fountain after all. As with every other Darkner in Deltarune, the game insists upon their personhood, most often via Susie, which is meant to be a framework through which we learn and reapply Deltarune's thesis to the Lightners themselves. If Seth's transition is meaningful enough to be discussed on screen, it is likely because Fox expects us to view Chris in much the same way. Their non-binary identity does not exist in a vacuum, and the presence of so much transfeminine coding for both Chris and Ralsei's characters implies that the game itself is, indeed, meant to comment on the specific transmisogyny present in the JRPG genre. Staying on the topic of Chris, and coincidentally videos that have uploaded while I worked on this script, we should talk about the implications that Aqua has for Chris's character. Cassidy the Puppet Wraith uploaded a video on this topic, and, largely, it's hard not to agree with the ideas they propose. Chiefly, beyond the visual similarities the two hold, Cassidy proposes that Chris and Aqua share the similarity of holding more than one core soul color, or at least that Chris's has changed over the course of their life, from Aqua to the red we see now. This, in their video, is not because Chris's personality drastically changed, but because our soul supersedes their own. This is a good idea. It works and seems to be quite clearly what Toby is signaling. We can glean a little more about Chris's past through Aqua. Perhaps that the trauma they experienced through Dessa's disappearance and Asgore's investigation changed them. Or perhaps we can learn a bit about who they are prior to our interference. While I do think this is the intended purpose Aqua holds in the game's narrative, given that Chris is the Aqua silhouette in Asgore's monologue before sealing the first fountain, a misconception I've seen in Cassidy's comments and elsewhere is that Aqua is flatly how Asgore remembers Chris. I resist this idea as the sole reason for Aqua's identity because it, on its own, might suggest a transmasculine Chris. Asgore's memory of Chris through Aqua would suggest that they are still his little girl deep down in Asgore's heart. Not only does this make little sense when taken with the rest of the characterization analyzed in this video, but it simply does not hold up based on what Chapter 5 itself presents. There are a handful of reasons why Asgore's perceptions and associated connotations with the flowers alone does not create the darkness they become, but chief among them are two. Firstly, Chris made the fountain. Their perceptions will have had at least as much of an effect on the darkness therein as Asgore's possibly could have, lest we forget how, even just one chapter ago, Susie recreating a fountain that she did not originally make failed to reproduce Gerson the way presumably the knight remembered him. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, is that the flowers' identities are their own. As the chapter concludes, it presents to us the concept of what it means to be a living object within a dark world. The flowers are alive, but they have no soul. They thus exist in the dark world as a sort of Schrodinger's dustner. They are neither quite darkners nor lightners, and while the lack of any soul in their bodies means their forms drastically change in the dark world, their life, and their presumable consciousness allows them to identify still as themselves. The dark world has given them the agency to make their dreams of supporting Asgore come true. These dreams, effectively, are their personalities. Furthermore, we can see that Asgore's perceptions are superseded by the flowers' own identities, because while Asgore correctly pairs Chris with Aqua, and himself with Flowery, his perceptions of who represents Asriel and Toriel are not as clearly correct. Namely, while Toriel is purple during his monologue, Seth seems to be more generally accepted by the Aqua is Chris's past theorists as a representation of how Asriel acted during his own childhood. My point here is that each of these perspectives are muddled, tangled up in the soup of connotations and determination that is the Dark Fountain. Aqua still quite clearly is Chris, so to speak, and to a certain degree. However, her choice to be Aqua, a girl, is nonetheless reflective of her own dream. It's interesting then that Aqua does want to be a girl, as she is only one of two true flowers to identify as such. This is perhaps less meaningful when you notice that the flowers are evenly distributed among male, female, and non-binary identities, meaning that it perhaps is not out of the ordinary that there are so few girls among their group. Despite that, what each flower's identity shares is that they are explicitly inhuman, genderless things actively wishing to be gendered. In a way, one could argue that this makes each of them representative of a transgender expression, at least through allegory, even outside of Seth's explicit discussion of their name and identity. In fact, it's worth noting that the exact hangout scene that Infizero cites surrounding Seth has every flower appear, and they understand Seth as quickly and implicitly as Flowery does Ralsei. Alternatively, one could argue that this is a problematic interpretation by my own logic, as I previously decried the all humans are non-binary theory as being disempowering compared to the more active identity that Chris genuinely exhibits. This is what makes it so meaningful that the flowers are not all non-binary, and that, for Seth, non-binary identity is explicitly mentioned as important where it does appear. This gender identity is not simply a given thing. It is not guaranteed by any bioessentialist understandings of the flowers' bodies. It is, in full effect, the manifestation of who the flowers are. This is all even without mentioning how the flowers' insistence that they are human rather than flowers mirrors Chris's own body dysmorphia and trauma surrounding whether or not they needed to be a monster to please their family. So, effectively, what I believe Aqua to be is the following. She is her own person, in universe, full stop. Yet, imagining Fox's perspective as the author, Aqua has a certain role within the narrative which she fulfills by signaling what and who Chris is, even outside of our control. That she is young does suggest that some of this is lost to them now, but that Chris has a hand in her creation means that there remains some truth in Aqua's expression. As such, that she is specifically a girl suggests that Chris values femininity, even despite their non-binary identity. And, speaking frankly, I see transfemininity in this interaction again because I myself am a trans woman. While this is perhaps projection, and I do admittedly identify very closely with Chris's struggles, I do not see my past self as a little boy. I was a girl then and now, even if it had to be hidden away. That Aqua is so unabashedly joyous and girly then reads to me as wish fulfillment for the trans feminine reading of Chris. Both Chris and Aqua are able to find joy in and reclaim their more troubled pasts by allowing themselves to be girls together, even if only for as long as the Dark World's dream lasts. And, truly, I would not be able to imagine Chris getting along with Aqua under the trans masculine interpretation, considering she would then be a representation of their dysphoria and the person they no longer want to be. Otherwise, for the trans feminine reading of Chris, this chapter contains much of the romantic rejections I previously analyzed, so I won't dwell on it for too long. Instead, something worth noting in the Light World is how the mirror dialogue has changed, as it does every chapter. The dialogue seems especially interesting following Chapter 4, where it was a relatively positive sentiment. Together with Susie, Chris was able to face themselves, and not feel any shame over who they are. Susie accepts them, and, further evidencing that Chris does want to find love, they feel the best about themselves when someone unabashedly sees them for who they are. Alternatively, at the beginning of Chapter 5, Chris quite clearly is dealing with dysphoria when alone, the narration asking "who is that?" and describing how they look away. This is more generally linked to Chris's body dysmorphia, given that surviving a night without the soul seems to have utterly drained them, leaving them wondering who they really even are. The stark difference between the two seems to connect their sense of self-worth directly to how readily they are able to find connection with other people. Perhaps, in other words, how readily they can find love. In either case, both of which seem relevant to Chris's story, it would be hard to deny the outright queerness in favor of the blank slate idea. Chris's personhood, evidenced by Undertale, Aqua, Seth, and all the remaining instances I've covered here today, is intertwined with their non-binary identity in a way that cannot simply be written off or ignored. To do so is to neglect a major element of the game's storytelling and emotional affect. Instead of focusing on all the little pieces of evidence for Chris then, I want to turn to the other major Chapter 5 character that brings transfemininity to the forefront of Deltarune's narrative, Pink. Considering Mad Mew Mew's previous use in Undertale, I and many of my friends within the fandom were particularly excited to see Pink bring back the same concepts. And, in many ways, the role Pink holds parallel to Mad Mew Mew mirrors the one Spamton does with Mettaton. Given that the ghost monster part of Pink is implied to be Deltarune's equivalent of Mad Mew Mew herself, it is understandable that most of the character is preserved and carried over between the two games. Being a secret boss, Pink gives the character the opportunity to be explored in a way that Undertale itself never fully allowed, considering that the actual Mad Mew Mew content was contained largely to the Switch version of Undertale. This is so relevant to the conversation in this video because Mad Mew Mew was one of the few relevant trans-feminine characters in Undertale, the other being, what, the unnamed lion? As much as I love her, she's an example of how transfemininity has always taken a bit of a backseat compared to transmasculinity in Undertale, if Mettaton holds as a transmasculine coded character. So, come to today, where Pink is now as relevant as Spamton, her treatment in Deltarune is a justice compared to how obscure Mad Mew Mew previously was. Furthermore, the new context of the Dark World allows Pink's character to be complicated and developed further than simply being a retread of Mad Mew Mew's own arc, one for one. Pink's boss fight suddenly introduces plurality to Deltarune, where it had otherwise been largely irrelevant outside of our relationship with Chris perhaps being allegorical for the same type of experience. That Pink is specifically plural, associated with transfemininity, and is quite clearly another Chris fight, suggests much about the way we are expected to interact with Chris. Most telling is that there is no stereotypical good and evil alter between Pink's personalities, and that the solution to her battle is an emphasis on self-love and acceptance. As Ralsei insists, her body deserves a say, and only through giving it one can the two of them achieve their own dreams. As such, the obvious ramifications for our relationship as the player with Chris is that the game is now telling us not to place our own desires over their own. Taking this simultaneously with the ideas surrounding Chris's flirting, their desire for love, and the noticeable differences between the ways Pink and Spamton treat Chris, the game is finally beginning to state its thesis about the relationship between the player and Avatar loudly enough for us to make sense of it. In trying to decide which of Pink or Spamton are the better parallels for Chris's situation, we as players must consider the reactions Chris themselves has to the aftermath of each secret boss. While they are both clearly relevant to their characterization, only Spamton attempts to actively objectify Chris. Naturally, Chris's reaction following Spamton Neo is one of panic. They scream and tremble as Ralsei and Susie struggle to comfort them, not only because they fear what will happen if their own strings are cut, but because Chris was not safe near Spamton the way they thought they were. Pink, alternatively, is nothing but kind to Chris following the battle. Yes, during the hangout scene I described earlier, but more notably in the dialogue that was added in the most recent patch as of writing. That Pink's body actively tends to and warns Chris about Friend and the eggs is behavior completely absent from Spamton's relationship with them. There is solidarity between Pink and Chris here, as obscure as the scene is, demonstrating that they are more alike than they are different. That each of them hold relevance to Chris's character is perhaps reflective of their non-binary identity, ultimately non-conforming in nature. But that only Pink is so protective of Chris speaks to the relative safety of trans-misogyny effective spaces compared to those that are overwhelmingly exempt from trans-misogyny. Another thought that occurred to me more recently, especially following the new scene with Pink in the shop, is how well Spamton and Pink parallel each other, rather than just Chris. While I'm not sure what this little detail will mean going forward, it's fascinating that both arguably trans characters that serve as strange mentors for Chris share the cat puppet element. This element has stood largely as an outlier compared to the game's other elements, which generally match traditional magic systems in RPGs. And yet, Pink being obviously cat and more dubiously a puppet via her possession, has suddenly given this element a much more obvious role and identity. Somehow, it seems likely that a person's element will be cat puppet if they're transgender. It's kind of bizarre to imagine, especially considering how I have no idea what this would mean for Friend down the line, but each of these plot-relevant trans identities match this element. The eggs are an obvious reference to trans culture. Ghost monsters have always needed to possess ideal bodies to achieve self-actualization. They still do in Deltarune. Spamton is obviously a puppet, strings and all, and Chris is being possessed by us. They even seem to be a furry, though they're more of a puppy thing than a cat thing. Is Task Manager a trans woman? Perhaps I got a bit distracted with that last part, but I'll leave it in for you so you can think about it for your own theories and develop new ideas about what Friend means for this transfeminine reading of Deltarune. The final things I want to cover here today are the metatextual implications of the transfeminine Chris reading. Earlier, I described how I believe this reading is intentional because of the largely metatextual reasons. Fox knows both what the stereotype and audience for the RPG is. It's nerdy, it's traditional, and it is overwhelmingly male. Whether it is the player themselves that is male, or simply that they expect the protagonist to be male, because it nearly always is, Deltarune expects us to think of Chris as more male than non-binary, and certainly more male than female. This is not out of any expected malice on the individual player's end, but because that cultural expectation for the genre is simply so strong. I fully expect that, as part of the game's messaging about fiction being real enough to matter, the avatar's choices and opinions mattering as much as the players, and moral play necessitating queer play, Chris and Ralsei's identities are each intertwined with the ways femininity is oppressed by more traditional, conservative, and limiting frames of thinking, such as those upheld by the prophecy. And, as I previously described, the weird route is by far the most obvious example of this dynamic in the entire game, largely because it is the first to have explicitly shown us its correlation between queer identity and the variable ethics of our play. I do expect this to start being more relevant in the standard route, if not in a hidden best route, especially now that we have all of the eggs, are coming to the end of the Shadow Crystal side quest, and are only seeing more of Ralsei's femininity as the game progresses. Where the weird route has gone in Chapter 5 complicates things a bit on my assertion that it decreases queerness though, as Noelle makes an interesting comment. She believes that Chris is at their most interesting on the weird route. And, further, her disdain for everyday life might suggest that she finds the false freedom offered by our control preferable to the prophecy-enforced love that she might have for Susie. However, I don't wholly believe that this is the real message Deltarune wants to present as its thesis. Noelle and Chris are obviously under duress in the weird route, not to mention how everything you do to enable it flies in the face of all other characterization the game has given Chris. Time and time again, the neutral routes, or any of the ones that follow the game's story as normal, stress to us that, for the happiest possible ending, if one really even does exist, is with Chris. It gives them agency, it upholds their identity, and through those, it lets them be truly free. The weird route is expressly opposed to each of these ideas, controlling not just Chris, but Noelle. Each moment is characterized by violence. We coerce her into murder, we do something to her that eerily resembles abuse, and we ultimately drive Noelle and Chris towards self-harm at the lake. There, almost certainly, is going to be an alternative that aligns with moral play the way Fox has previously presented it. And, not to be inflammatory, but each of these ideas align with the way our real-world fandom has previously responded to Chris and continues to respond to Ralsei. Given that, following ideas presented in the device theory, Fox wants us to believe that the layers of reality below our own are real enough to matter and impact our lives even after we finish playing, I do believe that the way we treat these characters in the fandom sphere is reflective of whether we have truly internalized the game's messaging. As I said when I began this video, identifying queerness in Undertale and Deltarune is not as simple as claiming a character for our own. We cannot simply appropriate these entities where and when they please us, or where and when we identify with them. Their identities exist as a thing to be cherished, understood, and learned from before they are simple toys to be played with. As such, the fandom's tendency to refer to Chris using he/him pronouns, or refuse to acknowledge Ralsei's transition outside of where it is completely impossible to ignore, are each examples of immoral play extending beyond the game. Our choices reach the characters, not only in scenarios like the weird route where we actively endanger them, but in our real-world perceptions of them. Think for just one moment. There's a reason why your screen is displaying the wiki's pronouns for each character. Just as Susie is not able to recreate Gerson, if we try to reconstruct Chris and Ralsei removed from their transfemininity, we will not be able to. We can certainly try, and perhaps we will succeed in creating something that resembles life, but those will not be the Chris and Ralsei you love.